Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The Bitterroot Valley of Montana, winter of 1878. A brutal season, even by the standards of the hardened men who call these mountains home. 6 feet of snow blanketed the passes, and temperatures had plummeted to 30 below zero for weeks on end. The frosted pines stood like sentinels against the stark white landscape, their branches sagging under the weight of accumulated ice. At night, the cold was so intense that trees would split with explosive cracks that echoed across the valley, startling both wildlife and settlers from uneasy slumber. Morning light revealed new fissures in trunks that had stood for decades, testament to the raw power of winter in the high country. The Bitterroot River, normally a vibrant artery of commerce and sustenance, lay dormant under a thick shield of ice, its voice silenced until spring's inevitable thaw. While most homesteaders huddled in their cabins, burning through precious wood supplies and waiting for the thaw, something unusual was happening at Jedediah Holloway's homestead on the North Fork of the river. His cabin, situated on a gentle rise overlooking a bend in the waterway, had long been a landmark for trappers and traders navigating the valley. Built in the 1860s during Holloway's first years in the territory, the structure represented frontier craftsmanship at its most resourceful. Hand-hewn logs notched with precision, a stone chimney constructed from river rocks selected for their natural fit, and roof beams salvaged from a lightning-struck pine that Holloway had discovered on a hunting expedition. Like the man himself, the cabin embodied self-sufficiency, refined through years of adaptation to the unforgiving Montana wilderness. Holloway, a reclusive trapper who had ventured west during the final days of the fur trade boom, had constructed what locals initially dismissed as an unnecessary monstrosity, an elaborate wooden structure spanning 16 feet in length and rising nearly 7 feet tall beside his cabin. Resembling a series of cascading shelves with wooden troughs connecting large barrels, the contraption was unlike anything seen in the territory. Constructed primarily from pine planks, split by hand, and shaped with tools Holloway had maintained for decades, the structure represented hundreds of hours of labor spread across the previous summer and fall. He had harvested, processed, and seasoned each component himself, working with the methodical patience that characterized his approach to all aspects of frontier life. When questioned by passing traders, Holloway simply called it his river cleaner, and continued his work, seemingly indifferent to the mockery that followed. Few knew the full extent of Holloway's background. The fragments recorded in county documents and reminiscences of longtime settlers painted a portrait of a man who had arrived in the valley around 1862, already middle-aged and bearing the physical marks of a hard life in the wilderness. Standing just under 6 feet tall, with a frame lean from decades of frontier living, Holloway's most distinctive feature was a snow-white beard that contrasted sharply with his perpetually sun-darkened face. His eyes, described by Dr. Landry as remarkably alert and penetrating for a man of his years, missed little in their constant assessment of the world around him. He dressed in practical frontier attire, buckskin leggings, wool shirts traded from passing merchants, and a distinctive otter fur cap that had become his identifying feature throughout the valley. He spoke little of his past, though occasional references suggested time spent among the Salish people, service as a guide for early government surveys, and possibly a period trapping with Hudson's Bay Company, far to the north. One settler, Jacob Thornton, recalled in a later interview that Holloway had once mentioned attending a proper school back east in his youth, though he quickly changed the subject when pressed for details. Another longtime resident claimed Holloway had shown him a tarnished silver pocket watch inscribed with the name of a prestigious Philadelphia academy. though this artifact was never found among Holloway's possessions after his death. What distinguished him from many mountain men was his literacy and meticulous record-keeping, skills unusual for his profession, but which would prove consequential in the events to come. Unlike many frontier figures whose knowledge remained solely in memory, Holloway documented his observations in a series of hand-bound journals crafted from whatever paper he could obtain, ledger sheets from trading posts, pages from outdated almanacs, and occasionally proper stationery acquired during infrequent visits to larger settlements. His handwriting, described by those who later studied his journals, reflected formal education, precise, consistent, and employing vocabulary that suggested significantly more schooling than most frontier inhabitants received. Holloway's Folly, as it came to be known throughout the valley settlements, consisted of a series of 6 interconnected barrels positioned at decreasing heights. Each contained distinct layers of materials, the first filled with crushed granite and river stones, the second with varying grades of sand, the third with charcoal from specific hardwoods that Holloway traveled 3 days to obtain, the fourth with more fine sand, the fifth with crushed quartz he'd mined from a hillside claim, and the final barrel containing what appeared to be precisely arranged silver coins at the bottom. The entire structure was meticulously sealed against the elements with pine pitch and beaver grease, techniques Holloway had learned from Salish natives years before. The construction process itself had become something of a spectacle during the previous summer. Travelers along the North Valley Trail would often stop to observe Holloway's meticulous work, sometimes offering unsolicited advice that the mountain man invariably ignored. Martin Calloway, who operated a small trading post 5 miles downstream, later recalled, Holloway would spend hours just fitting 2 pieces of wood together, testing the seal by pouring water through, and watching for the smallest leak. Most men would have completed the whole contraption in the time he spent on a single joint. But there was something admirable in his thoroughness, even if none of us understood what he was building. The barrels themselves represented a significant investment of resources. Each had been carefully selected from those available at trading posts throughout the valley, with Holloway sometimes traveling considerable distances to find vessels that met his specific requirements for wood type, construction quality, and previous contents. He rejected several that had held salt pork or pickled goods, explaining to a curious onlooker that the taint never fully leaves the wood. Instead, he selected barrels that had contained flour, dried beans, or ideally nothing at all. Each underwent extensive cleaning and modification before being incorporated into his system, including charring the interior of certain barrels with a controlled fire to create an additional filtration layer. What made this construction even more perplexing to his neighbors was that Holloway's cabin sat less than 50 yards from what appeared to be a pristine mountain spring. The spring emerged from a rocky outcropping on his property, forming a small pool before continuing downhill toward the river. Its water was clear and cold year-round, seemingly offering an ideal water source without elaborate filtration. Why would a man expend such effort to filter water when clear water bubbled from the ground nearby? This question was often posed at community gatherings, accompanied by knowing glances and subtle tapping of fingers to temples. Such elaborate work for seemingly no purpose reinforced the settlement's view of Holloway as an eccentric, perhaps touched by too many solitary winters in the high country. The answer would only become apparent months later, recorded in the Bitterroot County Register and preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives until their rediscovery during renovations in 1963. The construction of Holloway's Folly had begun the previous summer, coinciding with a period of unusual observation noted by those who occasionally interacted with the mountain man. For weeks he had been seen collecting water samples from various points along the North Fork in glass jars, which he labeled and stored in a cool corner of his root cellar. Several witnesses reported seeing him hold these jars to the light, studying their contents with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He established a consistent routine of collecting samples at the same locations throughout different weather conditions and seasons, creating what amounted to a systematic study of the river's changing properties. When Marcus Whitman, a local hunter, inquired about this peculiar habit, Holloway had replied cryptically, "Water tells stories if you know how to listen. This river's been talking for 10,000 years. This river's telling tales most folks ain't hearing yet." When pressed further, he had shown Whitman 2 samples taken from the same location 1 month apart. To the hunter's eye, both appeared identical, clear mountain water. But Holloway pointed out subtle differences in clarity and sediment that were invisible to the untrained observer. "The river changes with the season," he explained, "changes with the weather, changes with what happens upstream. Most folks see water as just water. It ain't. It's a living thing, carrying everything it touches." This perspective, understanding water as a dynamic system rather than a static resource, represented an ecological awareness unusual for the time. While indigenous peoples had long recognized such relationships, European-descended settlers typically approached natural resources from a more utilitarian standpoint. Holloway's position between these worldviews, influenced by both his formal education and years of living close to the land, allowed him to develop insights that bridged traditional knowledge and empirical observation. The winter of 1878 proceeded with the predictable rhythm of frontier life. Supplies dwindled as February arrived. Woodstocks diminished cabin by cabin, with many families consolidating into fewer rooms to conserve heat. Those with southern exposures fared better, able to capture precious hours of winter sunlight that provided natural warming. Others relied entirely on their fireplaces and small iron stoves, feeding them constantly with increasingly scarce fuel. The general store in town recorded its lowest inventory since opening 5 years prior. Flour became scarce by mid-month with rationing implemented across the settlement. The ledger from February 15th notes, "Last barrel of wheat flour distributed today, only cornmeal and small quantity of rye remaining. No resupply expected until road conditions improve." The community smokehouse, usually well stocked with preserved venison and elk, showed alarming gaps on its hanging racks. Game had been unusually scarce during the fall hunting season, with many attributing the shortage to the early onset of winter driving animals to lower elevations outside the valley. Those who had successfully preserved meat during the abundant previous year shared with less fortunate neighbors, but by February, even these reserves showed signs of depletion. Snow continued to accumulate, reaching depths that prevented travel along even the most frequented routes. Mail delivery ceased entirely for 6 weeks. The last stagecoach had passed through in early January, its driver reporting conditions too dangerous for return until spring thaw. Isolated from the outside world, the valley's inhabitants settled into the familiar pattern of frontier survival: careful rationing, rotating community meals when possible, and the constant vigilance against cabin fever that had claimed more than one mind in seasons past. Those with sufficient provisions shared with neighbors more poorly supplied, maintaining the unwritten frontier code that had allowed such settlements to survive the harsh Montana winters. The community hall, a simple log structure at the center of the settlement, became the focal point of social interaction, with families gathering there to conserve firewood in individual homes. Evening readings from dog-eared books passed from family to family provided rare entertainment. Biblical passages, adventure tales, and outdated newspapers from eastern cities all received equal attention from audiences hungry for distraction from the grinding monotony of winter confinement. Throughout this long winter isolation, Holloway maintained his solitary existence, venturing into town only when necessary for basic supplies. His visits became notable events precisely because of their rarity. The few who encountered him noted his robust appearance compared to others suffering the prolonged isolation. His cheeks retained their color, while others grew increasingly pallid. While most men in the settlement walked with the hunched posture of those conserving energy and warmth, Holloway maintained a straight-backed stride. His eyes remained clear and alert when others showed the glazed expression of winter weariness. He showed none of the weight loss common among settlers by late winter, maintaining the same lean but healthy physique that characterized him year-round. These differences were noted with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion in the town ledger kept by the general store proprietor, James Whitfield, who meticulously documented the comings and goings of Valley residents during that isolated winter. Whitfield's ledger, a leather-bound volume later donated to the Montana Historical Society, contains a revealing entry dated February 17, 1878. Holloway purchased salt, coffee, and 2 pounds of nails today. Declined offer of medicinal whiskey despite its popularity this season. When asked about his health, he attributed his vigor to clean living and cleaner water. Made cryptic reference to his filtration apparatus, claiming it removes what eyes can't see, left before further inquiry possible. Appears remarkably hale compared to most customers this month. This entry, overlooked by historians until the Comprehensive Review of Frontier Water Management Practices in the 1960s, provides one of the earliest documented references to Holloway's understanding of microscopic contamination. The concept that water could contain harmful elements invisible to the naked eye would not become common knowledge in frontier communities for decades. That Holloway had intuited this principle through observation and experimentation highlights the sophisticated empirical approach he brought to environmental challenges. As February gave way to March, the first tentative signs of thaw appeared. Icicles along south-facing eaves began to drip during midday hours. Patches of ground emerged on wind-swept slopes. The constant squeak of boots on dry snow transitioned to the wet crunch of daytime slush that refroze each night. Birds absent during the depths of winter returned in small numbers, their calls breaking the profound silence that had enveloped the valley for months. With these changes came the first stirrings of optimism among the settlement's residents. Plans for spring planting circulated. Talk of the expected supply wagons from Missoula grew frequent. The community began to emerge from the psychological burden of winter isolation, looking toward reconnection with the wider world. This transition period between winter and spring held particular significance in frontier communities. It represented both promise and peril, the opportunity to resume normal activities after months of confinement, but also new dangers from unpredictable weather, flooding, and the depletion of resources before new supplies could be obtained. The Bitterroot settlement had weathered this transition for 5 previous springs, developing community practices that addressed these challenges. What they could not anticipate was the unique threat that awaited them in the spring of 1878. In the second week of March, with the first hints of thaw beginning to appear on south-facing slopes, a new pressure emerged in the isolated community. 3 adults in the southern part of the settlement reported severe stomach ailments. Thomas Landry, the settlement's only physician, diagnosed them with a form of dysentery and prescribed bed rest and boiled water. Within days, the number of afflicted residents doubled. By the 3rd week of March, 37 cases had been recorded in Dr. Landry's medical journal, a leather-bound volume later preserved by his granddaughter and donated to the County Historical Society in 1921. Dr. Landry had come to the Bitterroot Valley in 1874 after medical training at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, seeking both opportunity and escape from the increasingly crowded conditions of eastern cities. At 42, he represented the perfect combination of formal education and practical experience for a frontier physician. His training had exposed him to the emerging field of bacteriology, though it predated many of the breakthrough discoveries that would transform medical understanding of waterborne illness. Equally important, his years on the frontier had taught him to adapt academic knowledge to practical conditions, incorporating local remedies and native treatments that had proven effective. This balance between formal training and practical adaptation made him particularly valuable to the isolated community and would prove crucial in the unfolding crisis. Physically, Dr. Landry presented a reassuring figure to his patients. Of medium height but substantial build, with a full beard beginning to show threads of gray, he conveyed both authority and approachability. His hands, remarkably steady even in crisis situations, were his most commented upon feature, with several patients noting their unusual warmth even in cold conditions. He maintained a small office attached to his cabin near the center of the settlement, equipped with medical instruments brought from Philadelphia and gradually supplemented with locally crafted tools and indigenous medicinal plants acquired through careful study with native healers. The pattern of illness spread systematically from the southern portion of the settlement northward. Those living along the main waterway suffered first and most severely. For the first time, suspicion fell upon the river itself, the same river that had drawn settlers to the valley for its seemingly pristine qualities. The symptoms followed a consistent progression: initial complaints of stomach discomfort and headache, followed by more severe intestinal distress, fever, and, in some cases, dangerous dehydration. The illness affected adults of all ages, though with varying severity. Those already weakened by winter conditions or pre-existing health concerns suffered most acutely. Dr. Landry's journal entry dated March 25, 1878, reads, "Patterns of affliction suggest contamination of the main water supply. Residents who rely on well water appear less affected, though not entirely spared. The late winter thaw may have introduced unknown elements into our water. Have advised all to boil drinking water until further notice. Symptoms consistent with enteric fever, though progression more rapid than typical cases observed in Philadelphia. Treatment focused on preventing dehydration and supporting recovery through rest and careful reintroduction of nourishment." The doctor's recommendation to boil water while sound proved difficult to implement consistently across the settlement. Wood supplies, already diminished by the long winter, were insufficient for constant boiling, in addition to cooking and heating needs. Many households, particularly those with ill members unable to gather additional fuel, found themselves forced to choose between warmth and safe water. Some residents, skeptical of the connection between water and illness, continued to drink directly from traditional sources, contributing to the spread of disease. Others attempted boiling, but did so inadequately, not maintaining the rolling boil necessary to eliminate pathogens fully. The settlement's limited resources further complicated response efforts. Dr. Landry's medical supplies, already stretched thin by winter ailments, proved insufficient for the growing number of cases. The community had no dedicated facility for treating the ill, necessitating home care with all its attendant risks of further contamination and spread. Most significantly, the settlement lacked the scientific knowledge and equipment to identify the specific nature of the contamination, forcing reliance on general preventive measures rather than targeted response. As illness spread, community cohesion began to fray. Those still healthy enough to travel began to avoid communal gatherings. The Sunday service, typically a reliable social anchor even in the hardest times, saw attendance drop by half, then by 2/3 as April approached. Neighbors who had readily shared resources throughout the winter now hesitated to open their doors. The trust that had sustained the settlement through months of isolation started to dissolve under the pressure of an invisible threat carried by the very water that sustained them. Reverend Samuel Porter, the community's Presbyterian minister, noted in his personal correspondence to church authorities in Helena, "Our congregation diminishes weekly, not from lack of faith, but from fear of contagion. Families who have worshiped together for years now keep their distance from one another. The illness attacking our settlement threatens not only our bodies, but the very bonds of community that have sustained us through hardship. We pray for guidance and relief as this affliction tests both our physical and spiritual resources." The situation was exacerbated by the seasonal timing. The thaw, while welcome after the harsh winter, created muddy conditions that made travel between homesteads increasingly difficult. The same melt that released the community from winter's grip now carried unknown contaminants into their water supply. Spring, typically a season of renewal and optimism on the frontier, had become a harbinger of illness and uncertainty. Community records from late March reveal increasing anxiety about basic survival needs. The general store ledger shows unusual purchasing patterns, with healthy residents stocking provisions that could sustain them without requiring water from common sources. Whitfield noted on March 29th, sold last 8 tins of condensed milk today. Unusual demand for preserved fruits and salted meats that require no cooking. Several customers inquired about rain barrels for collecting water directly, though none currently in stock. Dr. Landry's supplies of medicinal alcohol and willow bark extract dwindled rapidly. The general store's shelves, already depleted from the long winter, could offer little in way of remedies. With the nearest substantial medical supplies in Missoula, a journey impossible under current conditions, the settlement faced the prospect of confronting the illness with increasingly limited resources. By early April, 6 deaths had been recorded, 2 elderly residents and 4 adults previously weakened by winter ailments. The cemetery, still partially frozen, required extraordinary effort to prepare for burials. Men took turns breaking the semi-frozen ground with pickaxes, a grim labor made more difficult by their own weakened condition. Each funeral further strained community resources and morale. Reverend Porter conducted abbreviated services, acknowledging both the practical difficulties of gathering in cold conditions and the growing fear of contagion among mourners. The traditional community meal following burials, an important ritual of support for grieving families, was abandoned as concerns about food and water safety intensified. Each death increased the settlement's collective anxiety, transforming what had begun as a concerning outbreak into a full-fledged crisis that threatened not just individual health, but community survival. The Settlements Council, comprised of 5 long-established residents, met on April 2nd to address the crisis. Minutes from this meeting, preserved in county records, reveal the growing sense of desperation. Motion to send riders to Missoula for medical supplies approved, though Dr. Landry cautions journey remains hazardous due to river conditions. Emergency rationing of remaining medicinal supplies authorized. Discussion of temporarily relocating residents from southern area to northern homesteads tabled pending further information about disease spread. Councilman Wilson proposes exploring alternative water sources from eastern slopes. Expedition to assess feasibility scheduled for tomorrow, weather permitting. This meeting represented a pivotal moment in the community's response to the crisis. Having exhausted familiar solutions and facing deteriorating conditions, the council began considering more radical measures. The proposed Eastern Slopes expedition aimed to identify springs or streams unconnected to the main river system, potentially offering uncontaminated water sources. However, as council minutes note, significant labor would be required to transport water from identified sources, assuming suitable supplies discovered. Throughout this emerging crisis, one notable absence was recorded in Dr. Landry's journal. No report of illness from Holloway's cabin, despite its proximity to the North Fork. Have sent runner to inquire after his condition and any remedies he may employ, as natives sometimes possess effective treatments unknown to our medicine. The runner, a young man named Thomas Beck, returned with curious information that Dr. Landry recorded verbatim. Holloway appeared in robust health. When informed of settlement illness, he expressed no surprise, but rather a grim satisfaction. He stated, "That's why I built what I built." Rivers poisoned every spring thaw, not by any man's hand, but by nature itself. The upstream caves where animals winter, their leavings washed down with first melt. That, and the mineral seep from the western ridge. Been that way, long as I've trapped these waters. Indians knew it. Moved away from the river this time of year. We don't. Beck elaborated on Holloway's demeanor during this exchange. He wasn't gloating exactly, more like someone who'd warned about a danger and wasn't surprised when it arrived. He seemed genuinely concerned about the settlement, but also frustrated, like he'd been expecting this to happen for years. When I asked why he hadn't warned anyone more directly, he just said, "Been warning folks since '72. Nobody listens to an old mountain man when the water looks clear." This account suggests Holloway had indeed attempted to communicate his observations about seasonal water contamination to the settlement previously, but his warnings had gone unheeded. Town council records from 1872-1877 contain no formal mention of such warnings, though a brief note in the General Store Ledger from April 1873 mentions Holloway's peculiar claim about spring water being dangerous despite its clarity. The dismissal of his concerns likely reinforced Holloway's tendency toward isolation, contributing to his decision to develop an independent solution rather than continue futile attempts to convince the community. Beck further reported that Holloway had invited him to examine the wooden structure beside his cabin. The river cleaner was actively processing water from the North Fork, the same branch that flowed through the settlement. Water entered the top barrel, drawn from upstream by a simple mechanical pump Holloway had crafted from wood and leather. The contraption utilized a counterweight system that allowed a steady, controlled flow through the entire apparatus without constant manual operation. From there, it flowed through each successive chamber by gravity alone, emerging from the bottom as clear as glass. The water's journey through the 6 barrels took approximately 4 hours from entry to final filtration. Beck provided a detailed description of the system's operation. Holloway showed me how water entered through a wooden pipe extended 30 yards upstream, avoiding the immediate shoreline where sediment was heaviest. The intake was protected by a series of increasingly fine mesh screens that prevented larger debris from entering the system. He cleaned these screens daily, sometimes more often during heavy runoff periods. The first barrel contained larger stones at the bottom, graduating to smaller ones near the top, creating pathways for water while trapping substantial particles. Water exited this barrel through a carefully carved wooden spout into the second chamber, falling from enough height to create agitation that Holloway claimed helped the separation. Holloway's explanation of each chamber's function revealed a sophisticated understanding of water purification developed through years of observation rather than formal education. The first barrel's river stones and crushed granite removed larger particles and created pathways that slowed the water's flow. The second barrel's layered sand of varying coarseness trapped progressively smaller sediment. The third barrel's charcoal, specifically from oak, maple, and hickory, rather than the more common pine, absorbed impurities that affected taste and odor. Holloway explained to Beck that the type of wood used for charcoal significantly affected its purification properties. Pine, while abundant and commonly used for heating, produced charcoal that imparted its own flavor to the water. Hardwoods, particularly oak, created a more neutral filtering medium that removed impurities without adding their own characteristics. This distinction, discovered through Holloway's systematic testing of different charcoal sources, demonstrated his rigorous empirical approach to refining his system. The fourth barrel's fine sand captured any charcoal dust and further clarified the water. The fifth barrel's crushed quartz, which Holloway claimed had properties that work against the river's poison, likely contributed additional mineral filtration. This barrel particularly intrigued Beck, who noted that Holloway had arranged the quartz crystals in a specific pattern, rather than simply layering them. When questioned about this arrangement, Holloway would only say it was how the stones want to sit, suggesting an intuitive approach that complemented his otherwise methodical system. The final barrel's silver coins, precisely arranged in a pattern, Holloway refused to explain beyond saying it was how the water wants it, utilized the metal's natural antimicrobial properties, though this scientific principle remained unnamed and unknown to the mountain man, who had discovered its efficacy through trial and error. Beck reported that this final barrel contained exactly 27 silver coins of various denominations, positioned at apparently precise intervals across a bed of white quartz pebbles. Holloway demonstrated particular care in maintaining this chamber, checking the position of each coin daily and adjusting any that had shifted from their designated placement. The entire system operated without mechanical components beyond the initial pump, relying on gravity and careful design to maintain optimal flow rates through each filtering stage. Holloway had incorporated simple overflow channels that diverted excess water during heavy flow periods, preventing the system from backing up or allowing unfiltered water to contaminate later stages. These design elements revealed not just practical ingenuity, but a fundamental understanding of hydraulic principles developed through observation rather than formal education. Holloway offered Beck a cup of the filtered water, which the young man described as sweeter and lighter than any water I've tasted. Beck returned to Dr. Landry with a wooden canteen of Holloway's filtered water for examination, along with a crude diagram of the filtration system sketched at Holloway's direction. Dr. Landry's journal entry from April 6th notes, "Examined water sample from Holloway's device. Clarity exceptional. No visible sediment even when held to light. When compared with river water collected this morning, the difference is immediately apparent. River sample contains suspended particles and a faint yellowish tinge. Holloway's water remains crystal clear and lacks the metallic aftertaste currently present in our supply. Have requested Holloway share his filtering method with the settlement." The following day, Landry conducted a crude but effective experiment to test Holloway's claims about the water. He recorded, "Obtained 4 glass vessels of identical size. Filled first with water directly from river, second with well water from North Settlement, third with boiled river water, and fourth with Holloway's filtered water. Added small piece of fresh meat to each and sealed with wax paper. Will observe for signs of decomposition and contamination." This simple experiment, primitive by modern standards, nonetheless represented the application of scientific method in frontier conditions. The results, documented over the following days, would provide compelling evidence of the efficacy of Holloway's filtration system. Dr. Landry's April 10th entry details the outcome. Remarkable difference observed in water samples after 3 days. Meat in river water shows significant discoloration and unpleasant odor. Well water sample slightly better, but still showing signs of contamination. Boiled water sample considerably improved, but developing cloudy appearance. Holloway's filtered water shows minimal change to meat coloration and no detectable odor. Implications significant for managing current illness outbreak. The experiment, while simple, demonstrated key principles that would later become fundamental to water quality assessment. By using meat as a medium for bacterial growth, Landry had effectively created a primitive version of the bacterial cultures that would become standard in later water testing protocols. His systematic comparison of different water sources under identical conditions exemplified the emerging scientific approach to public health challenges. Most significantly, the clear superiority of Holloway's filtered water provided empirical validation for the mountain man's intuitive methods, bridging the gap between formal medical knowledge and frontier innovation. The settlement's initial reaction to Dr. Landry's request was mixed. Town Council minutes from April 7th, preserved in the County Records Office, reveal the skepticism that greeted the physician's suggestion. Motion to formally request Holloway's assistance met with considerable debate. Councilman Wilson expressed doubt that a mountain hermit's contraption could address a serious medical situation. Councilman Peters noted that if such a simple solution existed, surely it would be common knowledge. Several members raised concern about the cost and labor required to replicate Holloway's device at settlement scale. Dr. Landry's testimony regarding the water quality was questioned. Motion tabled until further evidence could be presented. The council debate reflected deeper tensions within frontier communities regarding sources of knowledge and authority. Formal education and institutional affiliation carried significant weight, even in remote settlements where practical skills often proved more immediately valuable than theoretical knowledge. Holloway, despite his years of successful adaptation to frontier conditions, lacked the recognized credentials that would have lent immediate credibility to his innovation. Even Dr. Landry, with his formal medical training, faced resistance when advocating for a solution that originated outside established channels. This resistance also reflected economic and social considerations. Implementing Holloway's system would require significant resources at a time when the settlement's supplies were already depleted. More subtly, adopting the mountain man's solution would mean acknowledging the community's previous error in dismissing his warnings, challenging established authority structures within the settlement. As council minutes record, Councilman Wilson specifically objected that accepting Holloway's assistance would undermine confidence in council leadership during a critical period. The physician's reaction to this hesitation was recorded in his personal journal. Council's reluctance frustrating but not surprising. Innovation from unexpected sources often meets resistance, particularly when it challenges assumptions about expertise and authority. The settler mentality values self-reliance, yet sometimes rejects solutions that don't originate from recognized institutions. Meanwhile, illness continues to spread. Have advised individual families to seek Holloway's assistance directly if council delays action. Several families took this advice, making the difficult journey to Holloway's cabin to request water from his filter. The mountain man, according to multiple accounts, provided water freely, but with a gruff reminder. Been telling folks about the spring melt for years. Nobody listens till their bellies ache. He refused payment, but asked each family to document the effects of drinking his filtered water compared to their usual supply, building an informal record of the filter's efficacy throughout the settlement. This grassroots adoption created a natural experiment that would prove crucial in eventually convincing the council. As Dr. Landry noted on April 12th, families using Holloway's water exclusively report marked improvement in symptoms within 48 hours. No new cases reported among these households despite continued illness in families using alternative water sources. Evidence increasingly compelling that Holloway's filtration addresses the primary cause of current epidemic. The council's hesitation proved costly. By mid-April, 63 cases of illness had been recorded, with 9 total deaths. The stagecoach, making its first run since winter, brought limited medical supplies but also carried news of the settlement's distress to Missoula. The territorial newspaper, the Missoulian, ran a brief notice on April 17th. Reports from Bitterroot Settlement indicate significant illness attributed to water contamination following spring thaw. Territorial health officer dispatched to investigate. Residents advised to exercise caution with water consumption until cause determined. This public acknowledgement of the crisis represented both a potential resource and a challenge for the settlement. While external assistance might bring needed supplies and expertise, the published account could damage the community's reputation at a crucial time. Frontier settlements competed for new residents and investment, with perceived health and safety conditions playing a significant role in these decisions. Council minutes from April 18th note concern that reports of illness may deter spring wagon trains from stopping in our settlement, affecting trade and potential new residents. As official help remained days away, Dr. Landry took the extraordinary step of approaching Holloway directly, bypassing the town council. Their meeting, recorded in Landry's journal, would prove pivotal. Rode to Holloway's cabin at first light, found him preparing pelts, seemingly untouched by the crisis affecting the settlement. When pressed about his filtering device, he showed neither pride nor reluctance to explain its operation. Rather, he expressed something like resigned disappointment in our collective failure to observe what he called the river's patterns. Holloway led the physician around his property, pointing out features of the landscape that influenced water quality throughout the seasons. He identified specific upstream locations where natural mineral deposits affected the water during spring runoff, creating conditions conducive to what modern science would later identify as bacterial growth. He showed Landry samples of river water collected the previous year, preserved in sealed jars, demonstrating the consistent pattern of contamination during thaw periods. Most significantly, he showed the doctor his filtration system in operation, explaining each component's purpose with a precision that belied his lack of formal education. The two men, despite their vastly different backgrounds, found common ground in their methodical approach to observation and problem-solving. Dr. Landry later wrote, "While our vocabularies differ significantly, Holloway and I share a fundamental commitment to empirical evidence." He lacks scientific terminology, but possesses a rigorous understanding of cause and effect developed through years of careful observation. In some respects, his isolated position has been advantageous, allowing him to develop solutions without the constraints of conventional thinking that sometimes limit formal scientific inquiry. What followed was Dr. Landry's detailed transcription of Holloway's explanation, preserved across 4 pages of his medical journal. The mountain man had spent 8 years observing the river's seasonal changes, documenting its clarity, taste, and the health effects on wildlife that drank from different sections. He'd noticed consistent patterns of illness among deer and elk that drank from the North Fork during spring thaw, while animals drinking from higher elevations remained healthy. He had observed beaver colonies relocating seasonally, avoiding certain sections of the river during specific periods. Holloway described watching foxes and wolves deliberately bypass certain water sources during spring runoff, traveling significant distances to drink from alternative locations. He had documented fish populations declining in specific river sections precisely during thaw periods, recovering only weeks later as water conditions naturally stabilized. Most significantly, he had correlated human illness patterns in the settlement with consumption of water from affected sections, noting that those who relied on well water or high-elevation springs consistently avoided the seasonal ailments that others experienced. Through careful observation and experimentation, Holloway had identified seasonal contamination sources that affected the watershed precisely during the period when settlers most celebrated the end of winter's isolation. He had mapped specific caves and mineral deposits that contributed to the contamination, creating a comprehensive understanding of the watershed as an integrated system affected by seasonal changes and geological features. Holloway explained to Dr. Landry that his approach to water filtration had been influenced by multiple sources: techniques observed among native tribes, methods gleaned from miners who needed to clarify water for gold panning, and his own experiments with materials readily available in the frontier environment. The combination of these influences had resulted in a system more sophisticated than any single source, adapted specifically to the conditions of the Bitterroot Valley watershed. He described learning from Salish elders about seasonal movement patterns that avoided contaminated water sources and their traditional methods of filtering water through layered materials. From mining operations, he had observed how different sediment types settled at varying rates and how certain minerals affected water clarity. His own contribution had been systematically testing these principles through controlled experiments, refining techniques based on observable results rather than accepting traditional practices without verification. The most remarkable aspect of Dr. Landry's account was the methodical nature of Holloway's solution. The filtration system had not been built in a single season of inspiration, but had evolved over 5 years of trial and error. Holloway had documented his experiments in a series of small leather-bound notebooks, which he readily shared with the physician. These notebooks, later photographed and preserved by the Montana Historical Society in 1965, revealed a mind of unexpected scientific rigor operating in isolation on the frontier. The notebooks contained detailed observations of water clarity, taste, and physical reactions following consumption from different river sections throughout seasonal cycles. They included crude but effective diagrams of various filtration methods tested over the years. Holloway had developed his own terminology for water conditions, referring to quick water, highly turbid, slow water, clearer but with suspended particles, and resting water, fully clarified through filtration. He tracked the time required for natural settling of river water samples and the improvement gained through various filtering materials. One particularly revealing entry from 1874 detailed Holloway's discovery of differential filtration rates. Sand from Riverbend filters faster than sand from North Bank, but doesn't clean as thoroughly. Mixed in layers, coarse sand, then fine sand, then coarse again, works better than either alone. Water moves through, but leaves more behind. This observation, made without knowledge of particle size distribution theory or flow dynamics, nonetheless captured fundamental principles that would later become standard in filtration system design. Another entry documented his systematic testing of different charcoals. Charcoal from pine leaves bitter taste after 3 days. Oak charcoal keeps water sweet for weeks. Tried maple, hickory, cottonwood. Oak and hickory work best. Must be burned hot and quenched right. Too much smoke in the burning makes for poor cleaning. This methodical comparison of different materials, with careful attention to production methods and long-term results, exemplified Holloway's empirical approach to refining his system. Holloway's first attempts at water filtration had been simple: layers of sand and charcoal in a single barrel. Each successive iteration added complexity based on observed results. He tested each version by filtering river water during the problematic spring thaw period, then preserving samples in sealed glass jars. The jars were left in his cabin's root cellar, then examined weekly for changes in clarity, smell, and the presence of what he called slimes, likely algae and bacterial growth. Those filtering methods that produced water remaining clear and odorless after a month became the foundation for the next iteration. One page detailed a particularly important discovery. Silver hunting pieces placed in bottom jar prevent slimes even after long storage. Water stays sweet. Tested against water without silver. Difference clear after 14 days. Pattern of placement matters. Flat surface touching water works better than coins on edge. 27 pieces in specific arrangement works best of all configurations tested. This observation, made without knowledge of silver's oligodynamic effect, its ability to kill bacteria, anticipated scientific understanding that would only be formally documented decades later. The multi-chamber system that now stood beside his cabin represented the culmination of these experiments. Each material had been selected for specific properties: granite and river stones to remove larger particles, sand of varying coarseness to trap progressively smaller sediment, hardwood charcoal to absorb impurities and improve taste. And the silver coins which Holloway had observed created an environment hostile to slimes. An early application of silver's antimicrobial properties decades before science would confirm this effect. Dr. Landry's journal reveals his struggle to reconcile Holloway's empirical approach with his own medical training. Have examined his documentation and the device itself. While lacking formal scientific language, Holloway's method shows remarkable alignment with filtration principles discussed in recent medical journals. His systematic approach to testing and refinement demonstrates an intuitive understanding of experimental method. Most striking is his use of silver at the final stage, which aligns with emerging theories regarding metal toxicity to microscopic organisms. What this frontier trapper has accomplished through observation rivals work being done in university laboratories. This assessment represented a significant intellectual leap for the physician, acknowledging that valuable scientific understanding could develop outside formal academic structures. It also highlighted the growing recognition within 19th century medicine that environmental factors significantly influenced public health, a perspective that would eventually lead to modern water treatment standards. The meeting concluded with Holloway agreeing to help construct a larger version of his filtration system for the settlement, though not without a pointed observation. Shame it took folks dying to make you listen. Nature speaks plain if you watch long enough. The physician returned to the settlement with detailed diagrams of Holloway's system and a proposal for implementing a larger version to serve the community. His presentation to the town council on April 19th emphasized both the scientific principles underlying the filter and its demonstrated effectiveness. He presented the results of his meat preservation experiment, comparing the samples side by side for council members to observe. He explained Holloway's years of careful documentation and the patterns of seasonal water contamination identified through this work. Most persuasively, he pointed to the absence of illness in households now using Holloway's filtered water, a pattern that had become increasingly apparent as the crisis continued. The town council, faced with mounting illness and the evidence presented by a respected physician, reluctantly approved resources for construction. Councilman Wilson, previously the most vocal skeptic, acknowledged, "While I maintain reservations about entrusting public health to untested methods, the current emergency demands action. If Dr. Landry vouches for this approach and Holloway will supervise construction, I withdraw my objection." Landry's journal notes, Council has allocated lumber and manpower to construct a filtration system based on Holloway's design. Holloway himself has agreed to supervise the work, though he seems bemused by our sudden interest in what we previously dismissed as folly. Construction began on April 21st with Holloway directing a team of 6 men. The settlement's carpenter, blacksmith, and several recovered patients contributed their skills. Using the town sawmill, they prepared lumber for a structure 3 times the size of Holloway's original. The work proceeded under Holloway's exacting supervision, with each stage tested before proceeding to the next. The general store ledger shows unusual purchases during this period: specific types of sand from the riverbank, charcoal produced from oak rather than the more common pine, and a collection of silver items donated by residents, mostly coins and small decorative pieces that could be positioned in the final filtration chamber. Holloway's approach to the construction revealed both his detailed knowledge of filtration principles and his ability to adapt techniques to larger scale. The settlement's version incorporated several refinements not present in his original design, including a larger intake capacity, a modified flow rate calculation to accommodate greater volume, and an additional access point that allowed cleaning of individual chambers without dismantling the entire apparatus. These adaptations demonstrated Holloway's ability to scale his empirical knowledge to meet community needs, a form of engineering that bridged frontier pragmatism with scientific understanding. Work proceeded rapidly, driven by continuing illness in the settlement. Holloway proved an exacting supervisor, insisting on precise construction methods and specific materials. Several workers noted his attention to detail in sealing each chamber against leakage and his insistence on testing water flow between stages before proceeding to the next. One worker, Joseph Miller, later recalled in an 1897 interview with the County Historical Society, "Holloway knew exactly what he wanted, wouldn't accept anything less than perfect, made us rebuild the second chamber twice because the sand layers weren't right, had us sift the sand through different screens until it matched his specifications. Seemed excessive at the time, but nobody questioned him after seeing the results." Miller's recollection continues. Most peculiar was his insistence on the silver arrangement. Had us place each piece according to a diagram he'd drawn, with specific distances between coins and certain coins facing heads up, others tails up. When I asked if it really mattered, he just said, "Water notices things we don't." Never explained further, but we followed his instructions to the letter. The materials themselves presented challenges. The specific hardwood charcoal Holloway required was in short supply, necessitating a special production run using oak logs from a stand near the western ridge. The crushed quartz came from Holloway's own mining claim, requiring transportation across difficult terrain. Most challenging was the collection of sufficient silver for the final chamber, as precious metals were scarce in the frontier settlement. The community's solution, recorded in council minutes, was to call for donations of any silver items that can be spared for public health, resulting in a collection that included everything from coins to a small silver pendant and even a partial dental filling. The community filtration system was completed on May 3, 1878. Standing prominently at the edge of the settlement's common area, it represented an unusual collaboration between a frontier community and the reclusive mountain man they had long dismissed. The structure's appearance differed significantly from Holloway's original, incorporating the settlement carpenter's more refined joinery techniques and the blacksmith's iron reinforcements at key stress points. However, the internal arrangement remained faithful to Holloway's design, with each filtration chamber replicating the precise layering of materials that had proven effective in his years of experimentation. Dr. Landry supervised the first official test, collecting water from the output pipe in a clear glass vessel and comparing it to untreated river water. Town records indicate that dozens of residents gathered to witness the demonstration, many still weakened from illness, but drawn by necessity and curiosity. The filtered water's clarity made an immediate impression. Dr. Landry's journal entry from that day reads, "Demonstration proved convincingly successful. Output water showed none of the turbidity or discoloration present in river samples. Public reaction shifted from skepticism to near-reverent appreciation in the space of moments. Holloway received more acknowledgement in those few minutes than perhaps the entire preceding decade. He accepted it with characteristic reserve, noting only that water doesn't care who filters it, long as it's done right." With the filtration system operational, the settlement established a rotation of workers to maintain it according to Holloway's instructions. Each household was allocated a daily water ration, transported in cleaned barrels to minimize recontamination. The system produced approximately 60 gallons of filtered water per day, sufficient for drinking and cooking needs, but not for other household uses. This limitation required continued conservation measures and careful distribution, managed by a committee appointed by the town council. The impact on public health was immediate and significant. Dr. Landry's records show that within the first week of filtered water distribution, new cases of illness decreased by more than half. By the second week, only 3 new cases were reported, all among individuals who had continued to consume unfiltered water from private sources. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Landry recorded a dramatic decrease in new illness cases. By the end of May, the health crisis had largely subsided, though its impact remained evident in the 9 fresh graves in the settlement cemetery. The territorial health officer, arriving belatedly on May 12th, expressed both surprise at the settlement's solution and professional interest in Holloway's system. His official report, filed with the territorial governor and preserved in the Montana State Archives, provides an outside perspective. The settler community has implemented an ingenious water purification system designed by a local trapper with no formal scientific training. Examination of the system shows it to be remarkably effective at removing both visible contaminants and presumably microscopic threats. The multi-stage filtration process employs principles similar to those being explored in eastern municipal systems, but adapted ingeniously to frontier conditions and materials. Water samples have been collected for further analysis in Missoula. Preliminary recommendation is that similar systems be considered for other settlements experiencing seasonal water quality issues. The health officer's report included detailed drawings of the filtration system and notes from interviews with both Dr. Landry and Holloway. It represented one of the first official recognitions of Holloway's innovation, placing his empirically developed technique within the broader context of emerging water treatment science. The report concluded, "This case illustrates the value of careful observation and local knowledge in addressing public health challenges on the frontier." While formal scientific training provides valuable foundations, we would be remiss to overlook the contributions of those who develop practical solutions through direct experience with local conditions. Summer arrived, and with it, the natural clearing of the river as spring runoff subsided. The community filtration system continued to operate, though with less urgent necessity. Holloway returned to his solitary pursuits, visiting the settlement only occasionally to inspect the filter's operation and suggest maintenance. His relationship with the community had fundamentally changed. Town council minutes from June 1878 note a unanimous vote to exempt Holloway from certain community obligations in recognition of his contribution to public welfare. The general store ledger shows occasional gifts left for him, coffee, ammunition, and once a new hunting knife, though residents reported he accepted these with reluctance, preferring to maintain his self-sufficient lifestyle. The summer and fall of 1878 passed without significant incident. The settlement recovered from the spring crisis, though with a new awareness of the river's seasonal dangers. Holloway's filtration system became an accepted part of community infrastructure, maintained according to his detailed instructions, and operated year-round despite the reduced need during clearer water periods. This preventive approach, initially questioned as excessive, gradually became standard practice, reflecting a shift from reactive to proactive resource management. The true test of the settlement's new approach to water management would come with the following spring. Throughout the winter of 1878-1879, regular maintenance of the filtration system continued according to Holloway's detailed instructions, which had been transcribed into the town records. When the thaw arrived in March 1879, the system was immediately activated at full capacity. Dr. Landry's journal from this period notes, anticipating potential contamination during thaw, we implemented filtration before any signs of water quality degradation appeared. This preventive approach represents a significant evolution in the settlement's management of natural resources. What was crisis response has become standard practice. The preparation extended beyond mere operation of the existing system. Based on Holloway's advice, the community had stockpiled additional filtration materials during the fall: fresh charcoal, replacement sand of specific grades, and extra sealing materials. They had constructed a protective shelter over the filtration system to prevent snow accumulation and freezing damage. Most significantly, they had established a regular testing protocol, examining water samples weekly throughout the winter to track any changes in quality, a practice directly adopted from Holloway's methodical approach to observation. The results validated this proactive stance. The settlement recorded only 7 cases of waterborne illness during the spring of 1879, all among individuals who had consumed unfiltered water from streams outside the town system. No deaths occurred. The contrast with the previous year's crisis provided compelling evidence for the effectiveness of both Holloway's filtration system and the broader preventive approach it represented. The Missoulian's May 1879 edition included a brief note. Bitterroot Settlement reports healthy spring season following implementation of water purification methods. Contrast with previous year's illness outbreak attributed to new filtration system designed by local trapper. Perhaps the most telling evidence of the system's impact comes from an unexpected source. The general store's inventory records show a significant decrease in medicinal purchases during spring 1879 compared to the previous 5 years. Items specifically used to treat stomach ailments and fever, peppermint extract, willow bark, and medicinal alcohol, showed purchases at approximately 1/3 the typical spring volume. This economic indicator, while indirect, provides compelling evidence of improved community health following implementation of Holloway's filtration system. Holloway himself left few direct records of his thoughts on these developments. His sparse personal writings, discovered after his death in 1893 and preserved by Dr. Landry's family, focus primarily on trapping locations, weather patterns, and observations of wildlife behavior. However, A rare personal reflection appears in an entry from June 1879. Settlement filter working as intended. River followed expected pattern during thaw. System handled the load. People staying healthy. Sometimes slow learning leads to better remembering. This simple observation encapsulates what would become Holloway's most enduring legacy. The filtration system itself, while innovative, would eventually be superseded by more advanced municipal water treatment methods as the frontier settlement grew into an established town. But the principle behind it, careful observation, followed by methodical problem-solving and preventive action, represented a shift in frontier thinking that extended far beyond water management. The filtration system's success led to increased interest in Holloway's other environmental observations. Town records from 1880-1882 show numerous consultations on subjects ranging from weather prediction based on natural indicators to sustainable game management practices. A particularly significant consultation occurred in 1881 regarding the placement of a permanent bridge across the North Fork. Holloway's observations about seasonal water flow patterns and riverbed stability influenced the final location, resulting in a structure that would withstand spring floods for over 40 years before requiring replacement. In the decades that followed, the settlement would face other environmental challenges, periodic drought, crop blights, and harsh winters that tested community resources. Town records indicate that with each new challenge, the Holloway approach was invoked: careful observation, documented patterns, experimental solutions, and proactive implementation. The mountain man's methodology had become embedded in community practice, though the man himself remained characteristically removed from these developments. An 1886 diary entry from Sarah Jenkins, a settler's wife, provides insight into how deeply Holloway's influence had permeated the community's thinking. Mr. Peterson consulted Holloway's almanac again before deciding when to plant this year's wheat. Holloway's almanac is what we now call the collection of weather observations the old trapper recorded over 20 years. More reliable than the published versions from back east, which know nothing of our valley's particular ways. The spread of Holloway's influence beyond the immediate settlement is documented in territorial newspapers and correspondence. By 1885, at least 4 other communities in western Montana had implemented similar filtration systems, each adapted to local water conditions but following the same multi-stage principle. An article in the Missoulian from September 1885 refers to Holloway-type filters becoming standard practice in settlements concerned with water purity, suggesting the mountain man's name had become associated with the technique throughout the territory. This regional adoption was facilitated by Dr. Landry's professional communications with other physicians and his presentation at the Montana Territorial Medical Society's annual meeting in 1883. His paper, titled Frontier Water Purification, a Case Study from the Bitterroot Valley, brought Holloway's innovation to the attention of medical professionals throughout the region. The paper, preserved in the Society's proceedings, emphasized both the technical aspects of the filtration system and the broader methodological approach that had produced it, positioning Holloway's work as a valuable intersection of frontier knowledge and empirical science. Holloway continued his solitary existence in the Bitterroot Valley until his death in 1893, at the approximate age of 76. His exact birth year remained uncertain. Dr. Landry, who attended him in his final days, recorded that even as his strength failed, Holloway maintained his habit of observing and documenting the world around him. His last journal entry, dated 3 days before his death, noted, "River running clear, filter still working. Some things outlast their maker." In his final conversations with Dr. Landry, Holloway revealed rare glimpses of his earlier life, including formal education in his youth, abandoned after family tragedy led him west. He spoke of lessons learned from native peoples across the territories, of years spent observing natural patterns while trapping and hunting, and of his growing concern that settlers often fail to understand the environments they occupied. According to Landry's account, Holloway's final coherent statement addressed this concern. Land speaks its own language. Most folks never learn to listen, always trying to make it speak theirs instead. The settlement honored Holloway with an unusually well-attended funeral for a man who had spent most of his life avoiding crowds. The town council minutes from April 1893 record a resolution to maintain the community filtration system in perpetuity as a testament to Mr. Holloway's contribution to public welfare. More significantly, they established a small fund to preserve his notebooks and journals, recognizing their value as both historical documents and practical guides. The funeral itself, described in a letter from Reverend Porter to his church superiors, reflected the community's complex relationship with the mountain man. Though Mr. Holloway rarely attended formal worship, his life exemplified stewardship of God's creation through careful observation and responsible action. The settlement gathered today not merely to mourn his passing, but to acknowledge a debt owed to one who saw clearly what others overlooked. It stands as a reminder that wisdom sometimes comes from unexpected quarters, and that true faith must be open to truth wherever it may be found. Following Holloway's death, his cabin and surrounding property became the subject of community discussion. With no known relatives, the land would normally revert to territorial control. However, the town council petitioned to maintain the original filtration system and cabin as historical landmarks. This petition, approved by territorial authorities in late 1893, represented an early example of historic preservation on the Montana frontier, recognizing the significance of Holloway's innovation beyond its immediate practical utility. As the frontier settlement transitioned into a permanent town with increasing connections to territorial governance and eventually statehood, the original Holloway filter was gradually modified and ultimately replaced by more modern water treatment facilities. However, the principles behind it, particularly the recognition of seasonal water quality patterns and the need for preventive filtration, remained foundational to the community's approach to resource management. The cabin itself, maintained as a local landmark, eventually fell victim to a forest fire in 1912. However, the site was marked with a simple stone monument bearing the inscription, "Here stood the home of Jedediah Holloway, whose observation of nature's patterns saved many lives and taught valuable lessons in frontier wisdom." This monument, still visible today, represents one of the few physical reminders of Holloway's presence in the valley. When the Montana Historical Society undertook a comprehensive documentation project of frontier innovations in 1963, Holloway's filtration system emerged as a significant rediscovery. Architectural historian Margaret Chambers, reviewing Dr. Landry's journals and the surviving town records, concluded, "What makes Holloway's work remarkable is not merely that he created an effective water filtration system through empirical methods, but that he understood the system's place in a larger environmental context. His notebooks reveal an ecological understanding decades ahead of formal scientific recognition of watershed dynamics." Chambers' assessment was reinforced by water quality engineer Robert Henderson, who analyzed Holloway's filtration design using modern scientific standards. His report, published in the Montana Historical Review in 1965, stated, "The multi-stage system developed by Holloway in the 1870s incorporates principles that would not be formally codified in municipal water treatment until the early 20th century. His use of sequential filtration through progressively finer media, activated carbon adsorption via hardwood charcoal, and silver's oligodynamic effect for bacterial control demonstrates an intuitive understanding of processes that modern science has only recently explained in detail. That he developed this system through observation and experimentation without formal training or access to scientific literature elevates his achievement from mere frontier ingenuity to genuine innovation. The Historical Society's project resulted in the publication of Frontier Innovations, Untold Stories of Montana's Pioneer Engineers, which dedicated an entire chapter to Holloway and his filtration system. This publication brought his story to wider attention, positioning him alongside more recognized frontier innovators and challenging traditional narratives about the development of environmental engineering in America. The book's author, historian Eleanor Rankin, noted, "Holloway's story compels us to reconsider our understanding of frontier knowledge production. Far from being merely a period of rudimentary survival techniques, the American frontier fostered sophisticated environmental adaptations that merit recognition in our technological history." The lasting impact of Holloway's work extends beyond the specific technique he developed. In a frontier environment that often rewarded immediate solutions and short-term thinking, he exemplified the value of patient observation, systematic experimentation, and preventive action. The contrast between his approach and the settlement's initial dismissal of his work provides a powerful lesson in frontier wisdom. Sometimes the most valuable innovations appear, at first glance, to be unnecessary complications. Holloway's legacy also challenges common narratives about frontier individualism. While he certainly embodied the self-reliance associated with mountain men, his most significant contribution came through community implementation of his ideas. The effectiveness of his water filtration system multiplied when scaled up for settlement use, saving far more lives than his personal version could have. The frontier required both individual initiative and community action, a balance that Holloway ultimately helped define in the Bitterroot Valley. Contemporary scholarship has placed Holloway's work within broader historical contexts of environmental adaptation and local knowledge systems. Environmental historian Carolyn West, writing in 2010, positioned Holloway as part of a tradition of vernacular science that flourished on the American frontier. Individuals like Holloway operated outside formal scientific institutions, yet developed sophisticated understanding of local environmental conditions through systematic observation and experimentation. Their contributions, often overlooked in traditional histories of American science, represent a parallel tradition of knowledge production uniquely adapted to frontier conditions and needs. The recovery of Holloway's story from historical archives reminds us that frontier history contains many such overlooked innovations, practical solutions developed through necessity and observation rather than formal education. For every well-documented technological advance from urban centers, countless adaptations and discoveries on the frontier went unrecorded or unrecognized beyond their immediate utility. In modern water treatment literature, Jedediah Holloway rarely receives mention. His multi-stage filtration system, developed through years of careful observation and experimentation, anticipated principles that would later become standard in municipal water treatment. Yet, like many frontier innovators, his contribution has been overshadowed by more formally documented developments from established scientific communities. The principles behind Holloway's filtration system, sequential treatment through progressively finer media, the use of charcoal for adsorption of impurities, and the antimicrobial properties of silver, now form the foundation of modern water treatment technologies. Contemporary systems employ advanced versions of these same approaches, using engineered media, activated carbon derived from various sources, and sophisticated disinfection methods. The underlying concepts, however, remain remarkably similar to those Holloway discovered through empirical observation in the Montana wilderness of the 1870s. Perhaps the most fitting testament to Holloway's influence is found not in historical records, but in the practices that outlived him. The mountain man's approach, identifying patterns, developing systematic solutions, implementing preventive measures, and adjusting based on results, became embedded in how the Bitterroot community approached environmental challenges long after the specific details of his filtration system had faded from common knowledge. Today, visitors to the Bitterroot Valley Historical Museum can view reproductions of Holloway's filtration system based on Dr. Landry's detailed diagrams. The original notebooks, carefully preserved through generations of local historians, provide insight into a methodical mind operating far from formal scientific institutions. Water testing conducted on a reconstructed version in 2015 confirmed what the frontier settlement discovered through necessity. The system effectively removes a remarkable percentage of contaminants using only materials available in the 1870s. The museum's most popular exhibit features a working-scale model of Holloway's filter alongside modern water treatment displays. The juxtaposition highlights both how far water treatment technology has advanced and how sound the fundamental principles of Holloway's approach remain. University students from throughout Montana visit annually to learn about water safety through the story of a reclusive trapper who, through patient observation and methodical experimentation, developed a solution that saved his community. Environmental science classes from the University of Montana regularly visit the exhibit as part of their curriculum, examining Holloway's work as an early example of ecological thinking. Professor James Harrison, who leads these field trips, notes, Holloway understood the watershed as an integrated system decades before such perspectives became common in environmental science. His observations about seasonal contamination patterns, the movement of pollutants through the water system, and the relationship between upstream conditions and downstream water quality demonstrate a holistic understanding that anticipates modern ecosystem approaches. The Holloway Foundation, established in 2005 by descendants of the original Bitterroot settlers, continues his legacy through environmental education programs throughout Montana. The Foundation's mission statement echoes Holloway's empirical approach, promoting understanding of local environmental systems through careful observation, documentation, and responsible action. Their programs emphasize hands-on water quality monitoring, enabling students to develop their own understanding of watershed dynamics through direct experience, much as Holloway did a century and a half earlier. When spring arrives in the Bitterroot Valley and the rivers swell with snowmelt from the surrounding mountains, locals still occasionally reference Holloway's wisdom, the understanding that preparation for predictable challenges is never wasted effort, that patterns observed over years reveal truths easily missed in a single season, and that sometimes the most valuable innovations initially appear unnecessary until the moment they become essential. The legacy of one mountain man's unbelievable filter extends beyond the lives it saved in a 19th century frontier settlement. It offers a timeless lesson about the value of careful observation, methodical problem solving, and the courage to implement solutions that others might dismiss as excessive until the moment when preparation meets opportunity and wisdom is vindicated by necessity.